The Galactic Institute of Advanced Combat Studies had a reputation that preceded it like the smell of sulfur from a Draknari's breakfast. Perched on the perpetually stormy moon of Nexus Prime, the Academy's obsidian towers scraped against lightning-split skies with the kind of architectural arrogance that screamed, "We produce the deadliest beings in the galaxy," and our insurance premiums reflect this fact. For 3 millennia, the Institute had maintained its position as the premier destination for species who took violence seriously, which in galactic terms meant everyone except the pacifist ethereals, and they'd been extinct for 2,000 years. So clearly their philosophy needed work. The Academy's motto, carved in 17 different languages across the main entrance's plasma-hardened stone, translated roughly to "through pain, excellence," though the hive mind delegates always insisted it meant profitable suffering for educational purposes. Semantics, really. The student body represented a carefully curated collection of the galaxy's most formidable warrior races. At the apex sat the Draknari, naturally, 8-foot-tall reptilian juggernauts, whose idea of a love tap could shatter reinforced titanium. Their scales gleamed with the kind of metallic sheen that suggested evolution had looked at armor plating and decided to make it biological. Below them, in descending order of general lethality, came the Vorthak with their crystalline exoskeletons and neural processing speeds that made quantum computers look sluggish, followed by the various hive mind subspecies, whose collective intelligence turned battlefield strategy into something resembling three-dimensional chess, played by precognitive grandmasters. Then there were the Ursine hegemony represented, who had weaponized the concept of bear hug into something requiring hazmat cleanup crews, the Aquatic Federation's amphibious shock troops, who could breathe both water and the terror of their enemy, and roughly 47 other species, whose applications for admission typically included documented evidence of having conquered at least one neighboring star system. The ranking system at the Institute was refreshingly honest about its prejudice. Combat effectiveness ratings were calculated using a complex algorithm that factored in physical strength, reaction time, strategic thinking capability, and something the academic council euphemistically called aggressive potential, which mostly meant how many things a species could kill before requiring medical attention. Draknari consistently topped these charts, which surprised absolutely no one, including the Draknari, who had built their entire civilization around the principle that might made right, and right made excellent recruiting posters. It was into this temple of sanctified violence that the human exchange student arrived on a Tuesday that seemed determined to be as unremarkable as possible. The shuttle from Earth, a quaint little blue marble in one of the galaxy's more forgettable spiral arms, docked with the kind of anticlimactic precision that suggested the pilot had been doing this job too long to care about dramatic entrances. The passenger manifest listed one human female, age classification, young adult, combat rating, to be determined, which had caused considerable amusement in the registrar's office. The betting pool on her survival duration had opened at 3 local days, though a few optimistic faculty members had wagered she might last a full week if they assigned her to theoretical courses only. The human's arrival had been negotiated through the usual diplomatic channels, wrapped in the kind of bureaucratic language that made potential military intelligence gathering sound like cultural exchange opportunity. The Institute's administration, possessing the collective cynicism of beings who had spent centuries watching various species attempt to murder each other, with academic rigor, understood exactly what this exchange represented. Earth wanted to see how the big boys played, and the galaxy's established powers were curious enough about this newcomer species to let them peek behind the curtain, assuming they survived the experience. What stepped off that shuttle, however, was sufficiently unremarkable to reinforce every preconception the Academy staff had carefully cultivated. The human stood roughly average height by galactic standards, possessed no visible natural weaponry, lacked the redundant organ systems that marked truly dangerous species, and appeared to be constructed from standard-issue biological components that wouldn't have impressed a military equipment catalog. Her skin showed no signs of radiation hardening, her reflexes seemed adequate, but unremarkable during the standard arrival processing, and she demonstrated the kind of polite deference that suggested either wisdom or terror. The admissions committee voted unanimously for terror. Professor Gorth, the Institute's director of academic placement, and a Draknari, whose scarred hide told the story of a distinguished military career written in plasma burns, conducted the human's initial assessment with the kind of professional thoroughness that barely concealed his amusement. Her physical capabilities registered as within acceptable parameters for fragile species. Her theoretical knowledge of combat doctrine proved surprisingly comprehensive, likely compensating for obvious physical limitations, and her psychological profile indicated standard non-predator species anxiety responses with possible adaptive potential. The placement decision practically made itself. Remedial combat theory, alongside the pacifist coalition refugees, the Herbivore Alliance representatives, and other species whose primary survival strategy involved elaborate surrender protocols. It wasn't meant as an insult, exactly, more like academic triage, ensuring that beings ill-equipped for the Institute's rigorous standards could still participate without becoming educational casualties. The human accepted her assignment with the kind of quiet grace that the faculty interpreted as relieved acceptance of her obvious limitation. She moved into the dormitory sector reserved for special consideration students, unpacked her modest belongings with efficient precision, and began attending classes with the punctuality of someone grateful for the opportunity to learn from her better. Nobody bothered to wonder why someone whose species had never bothered to contact galactic civilization before might have such comprehensive theoretical knowledge of interstellar combat doctrine. After all, the galaxy had been playing this game for millennia, and newcomers always started at the bottom. The first week proceeded exactly as expected, which should have been the first warning sign that expectations might need recalibration. The human's first week at the Institute unfolded with the predictable rhythm of a species learning its place in the galactic pecking order, or so the faculty assumed, which demonstrated the kind of intellectual arrogance that typically preceded educational moments of the uncomfortable variety. Remedial combat theory met in Lecture Hall 17, a space the architects had designed with the subtle condescension of beings who understood that some students required gentler treatment. The walls were reinforced to withstand only moderate explosions, the desks were sized for smaller frames, and the emergency medical stations were positioned for quick access, because even theoretical combat could prove hazardous when conducted by species whose survival instincts occasionally malfunction. The humans' classmates represented a fascinating cross-section of galactic civilizations. More diplomatically minded representatives. There was Yith, a Herbivore Alliance delegate, whose species had evolved past carnivorous tendencies roughly the same time they developed interstellar travel. Coincidence, they claimed, though their dietary restrictions suggested otherwise. Beside him sat two representatives from the pacifist coalition, beings whose philosophical commitment to nonviolence was matched only by their impressive collection of defensive technologies that could theoretically be repurposed for offensive application. Not that they would ever consider such a thing. Perish the thought. The class also included a handful of species whose combat ratings fell into what the Institute's classification system diplomatically termed developing potential, the kind of linguistic euphemism that meant they could probably handle themselves in a bar fight. Assuming the bar wasn't located in Drachnary space, Professor Nexus, a mid-tier Vorthak, whose crystalline carapace reflected the lecture hall's lighting and patterns that suggested either deep thought or chronic indigestion, approached the subject of theoretical combat with the enthusiasm of someone assigned to teach remedial mathematics to particularly slow children. His curriculum focused on the safer aspects of military science, logistics, communication protocols, basic tactical principles that wouldn't result in accidental casualties during classroom demonstration. The human absorbed these lessons with the kind of focused attention that her instructors interpreted as desperation, the wide-eyed concentration of someone trying to compensate for obvious genetic deficiencies through sheer academic effort. She took extensive notes, asked thoughtful questions about supply chain management in extended campaigns, and demonstrated the sort of theoretical grasp that suggested she might eventually understand why more impressive species consistently defeated her people in hypothetical scenarios. During physical assessments, the human's performance registered as thoroughly unremarkable by Institute standards. Her strength measurements placed her in the 42nd percentile among registered species, respectable for something that had evolved on a death world, but hardly threatening to beings who considered gravity training a recreational activity. Her speed ratings showed adequate reflexes for civilian applications, though nothing that would trouble a military professional. Most tellingly, Her endurance scores indicated standard mammalian limitations that would become problematic during extended operation. These results found their way into the Institute's comprehensive student database, where they joined thousands of similar profiles documenting the capabilities of various galactic species. The human's entry received a classification of non-threatening potential administrative applications, which represented the academic equivalent of a polite pat on the head. Meanwhile, in the advanced combat courses that occupied the Institute's primary training facilities, the real students were preparing for challenges that would make the humans' remedial coursework look like finger painting. Draknari Prince Korva, whose lineage could be traced back to the species' first interstellar conquests, led his cohort through exercises that involved actual plasma weaponry and gravitational manipulation, because anything less than potentially fatal training was considered poor preparation for actual combat. Korvash had earned his position through the traditional Draknari method of killing everything that stood in his way, then killing several additional things just to establish dominance. His scales bore the ritual scarification that marked his victories in single combat. His musculature suggested someone who used starship hulls as weight training equipment, and his general demeanor conveyed the relaxed confidence of a being who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through applied violence. The Vorthak strategic planning specialist, Zentith, approached warfare from a different angle entirely. Her crystalline neural matrix processed tactical scenarios at speeds that made real-time combat analysis look like strategic planning conducted via diplomatic courier. She could calculate the probability matrices for 1,000 ship engagements, while simultaneously managing resource allocation for 6 different campaign theaters, all while maintaining the kind of intellectual superiority complex that comes from being literally too smart for most conversation. The hive mind collective known as Unity of Purpose brought yet another perspective to advanced training: the terrifying efficiency of beings who shared thoughts at the speed of synaptic transmission. Their individual bodies were expendable components in a larger intelligence that treated casualties the way accountants treated rounding errors. They approached combat with the kind of mathematical precision that turned battles into spreadsheet problems with occasionally explosive solutions. These exemplars of galactic military excellence were dimly aware that the Institute housed lesser species in remedial programs, the same way university students might acknowledge the existence of elementary schools without paying them much attention. The humans' presence registered in their consciousness approximately the way one might notice a particularly unremarkable houseplant, present presumably serving some function, but hardly worth detailed consideration. The Institute's traditional curriculum built toward the semester's culminating event, the Grand Melee, a tournament that had been testing student capabilities for longer than most species had possessed written language. The competition served multiple purposes. It provided practical assessment of student progress, offered entertainment for the faculty, and maintained the brutal reputation that kept the Institute's enrollment applications appropriately selected. Previous Grand Melees had produced legendary conflicts that were still studied in advanced tactical courses. The famous battle between Draknari champion Vorthex and the crystalline collective Clarity and Violence had lasted 17 hours and required complete reconstruction of training complex Alpha. The strategic masterpiece orchestrated by hive mind strategist Perfect Unity of Death against a coalition of 6 apex predator species had become required reading for students of psychological warfare. This year's competition promised to maintain those standards, assuming the participants survived their preparatory training. The advanced students approached their preparation with the focused intensity of beings who understood that failure might involve more than poor grades. The Institute's commitment to realistic training environments meant that medical evacuation was always a possibility, and resurrection technology wasn't covered under standard student insurance policies. As the weeks progressed toward the Grand Melee, a curious pattern began to emerge in the Institute's daily routine. The human continued her remedial coursework with quiet diligence, but observers began noticing her presence in unexpected locations. She appeared in the library's restricted military history sections, researching conflicts involving species she couldn't possibly encounter in her theoretical classes. She attended optional lectures on psychological warfare techniques that were supposedly beyond her clearance level. Most puzzling,
She seemed to spend considerable time in the observation galleries overlooking the advanced training sessions, watching the real students prepare for actual combat. The faculty dismissed these behaviors as natural curiosity, an inferior species, attempting to understand the capabilities of their betters through academic voyeurism. Nobody considered the possibility that she might be conducting field research, cataloging the fighting styles, tactical preferences, and psychological profiles of beings who represented the galaxy's military elite. After all, what could a remedial student possibly do with such information? The Grand Melee sign-up period opened 3 weeks before the tournament, and the registration list filled with the expected names: Draknari Princes, Vortex Strategic Specialists, Hive Mind Collective Representative, and the various other apex predators who formed the Institute's actual student body. The betting pools opened simultaneously, with odds calculated based on 3 millennia of documented combat performance by participating species. At the bottom of the registration list, filed with the kind of administrative precision that suggested careful consideration of bureaucratic requirements, appeared one additional name that caused considerable amusement in the registrar's office. The human had entered the competition.
The Grand Melee commenced with the kind of pageantry that 3 millennia of tradition demanded, which mostly involved elaborate ceremonies celebrating violence as an educational tool. The Institute's combat arena had been configured for maximum spectacle environmental hazards that could crush starships, gravitational fields that treated physics as optional guidelines, and energy barriers that turned the fighting space into a shifting maze of death and academic assessment. Faculty members occupied the premium viewing platforms, their seats arranged according to a hierarchy that reflected both species dominance and tenure requirements. Students not participating in the tournament filled the remaining galleries, creating the kind of bloodthirsty audience that made gladiatorial combat seem like a peaceful hobby. The betting pools had reached astronomical figures, with most wagers placed on variants of which apex predator kills the others fastest. The human's presence in the competitor's staging area generated the sort of bemused attention typically reserved for clerical errors that had somehow achieved sentience. Tournament officials had double-checked her registration 17 times, assuming that administrative incompetence must explain how a remedial student had gained access to a competition designed for military professionals. Her fellow competitors acknowledged her existence with the casual indifference of lions, noticing a particularly optimistic field mouse. Prince Korvash stretched his massive frame with movements that suggested controlled nuclear reactions, each flex of his scaled musculature creating the kind of power displays that made seismic equipment register false earthquakes. His pre-combat preparations involved practicing strikes that could shatter reinforced barriers, not because the tournament required such force, but because Draknari warm-up exercises were other species' maximum combat capability. Zenteeth calibrated her neural matrices with the methodical precision of someone optimizing a weapon system, her crystalline carapace reflecting tactical probability cascades that processed thousands of potential combat scenarios simultaneously. Her strategic planning algorithms were already calculating victory conditions against every possible opponent combination, treating the upcoming violence like an elaborate mathematics problem with occasionally explosive solutions. The Unity of Purpose Collective synchronized their shared consciousness, creating a distributed intelligence network that could react to threats faster than most beings could recognize them. Their individual bodies moved with the eerie coordination of components in a perfectly tuned machine, each gesture reflecting decisions made by a collective mind that treated casualties as acceptable losses in service of strategic objectives. The tournament's opening rounds proceeded according to ancient tradition and modern expectations. Lesser species were eliminated with the swift efficiency of natural selection operating under laboratory conditions. A promising Ursan hegemony representative managed to last 4 minutes against a mid-tier Vorthax strategist, before being removed by medical evacuation teams, a respectable showing that would be remembered fondly at funeral services. The human's first opponent was a pacifist coalition delegate, whose philosophical commitment to nonviolence extended to remarkably sophisticated defensive capability. The match was expected to last approximately 30 seconds, assuming the human possessed enough survival instinct to surrender before serious injury occurred. Instead, the audience witnessed something that defied 3 millennia of accumulated combat doctrine. The human moved wrong, not clumsily, that would have been understandable, but wrong in ways that suggested she had learned combat theory from entirely different textbooks. Where experienced fighters expected direct assault, she utilized lateral positioning that made no sense according to established tactical principle. When her opponent deployed standard defensive matrices, she responded with attacks that targeted psychological pressure points rather than physical vulnerabilities. Most disturbing, she talked during combat. The pacifist coalition delegate found himself subjected to a continuous stream of observations about his defensive patterns, critiques of his strategic assumptions, and helpful suggestions for improvement that somehow made every successful defense feel like a failure. Within minutes of being trained to withstand physical assault was questioning fundamental aspects of his worldview, while simultaneously trying to avoid getting stabbed. The human won through what military historians would later classify as weaponized constructive criticism, leaving her opponent technically unharmed, but psychologically reconstructed. The victory was attributed to beginner's luck by faculty observers, though several noted that luck typically didn't involve such comprehensive psychological profiling. Her second opponent, a herbivore alliance representative, whose species had evolved elaborate camouflage capabilities, expected to leverage environmental advantages against an obviously inferior predator. Instead, he discovered that the human had spent considerable time studying his species' historical conflicts, understood the precise limitations of his adaptive camouflage, and had somehow deduced his exact location through analysis of subtle atmospheric displacement patterns. More unsettling, she had developed countermeasures specifically designed to exploit vulnerabilities that his species considered theoretical impossibility. The human demonstrated an understanding of herbivore alliance combat doctrine that exceeded what should have been available in any academic database, suggesting research sources that weren't included in standard curriculum material. By the tournament's third round, a subtle shift had occurred in the audience's attention pattern. The humans' matches were no longer dismissed as amusing intermissions between serious combat beings, who had spent lifetimes studying warfare, were beginning to notice tactical innovations that didn't appear in any recognized combat manual. Her elimination of a mid-tier Draknari student sent ripples through the faculty viewing section that registered on psychological monitoring equipment. The match hadn't been won through superior strength or speed, both impossible given physiological limitations, but through something far more disturbing: complete strategic anticipation of Draknari combat psychology. The human had maneuvered her opponent into a series of increasingly aggressive assaults, each one perfectly predicted and countered with minimal energy expenditure. She fought like someone who had spent considerable time studying Draknari tactical preferences, psychological triggers, and the precise moment when pride would overcome strategic thinking. The young Draknari found himself defeated not by a superior warrior, but by someone who understood his species' combat instincts better than he did. Prince Korvash, observing from the competitor's staging area, experienced the unprecedented sensation of tactical uncertainty. His species had conquered half the galaxy through the simple expedient of being stronger, faster, and more ruthlessly efficient than everyone else. The concept of an opponent who compensated for physical inferiority through comprehensive psychological warfare was theoretically possible but practically unthinkable. Zentith's probability matrices began generating error cascades as she attempted to calculate tactical projections for an opponent whose capabilities couldn't be quantified using standard military assessment protocol. The human's combat performance suggested training and knowledge that exceeded what should have been available to a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel, indicating intelligence sources that didn't appear in any galactic database. The Unity of Purpose Collective experienced something approaching confusion as their distributed consciousness tried to process combat tactics that relied on individualistic psychological manipulation rather than collective strategic thinking. Their shared mind, optimized for coordinated group activities, struggled to comprehend an approach to warfare that treated individual psychology as a weapon system. As the tournament progressed toward its final rounds, the Institute's faculty began to notice disturbing patterns in their carefully maintained world. The human wasn't just surviving against superior opponents. She was systematically demonstrating weaknesses in combat doctrines that had remained unchanged for centuries. Each victory revealed another gap in galactic military thinking, another assumption that had never been properly examined, another strategic blindness that had persisted because no one had ever been weak enough to require such innovative solutions. The human fought like someone who had studied every species' capabilities, not as a student learning from superiors, but as a researcher cataloging subjects for future reference. The tournament's final bracket contained exactly what 3 millennia of academic tradition had predicted: 2 apex predators, and 1 statistical impossibility that was beginning to make everyone extremely uncomfortable. Prince Corvash and the Unity of Purpose Collective prepared for their semi-final matches, with the growing realization that they might be participating in something more significant than a simple academic assessment. They were about to receive an education in the difference between being strong and being dangerous. The human waited for her turn with the patient attention of someone who had learned everything she needed to know, and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to demonstrate her conclusion. The tournament's final phase unfolded with the kind of tense anticipation typically reserved for natural disasters, that everyone could see coming but no one could prevent. The Institute's combat arena had been reconfigured for maximum lethality, environmental hazards that could atomize starship gravitational anomalies, that treated the laws of physics like polite suggestions, and energy barriers that shifted with the malevolent intelligence of something designed by beings who considered safety regulations an amusing philosophical concept. Prince Corvash entered his semi-final match against the Unity of Purpose Collective with the supreme confidence of someone whose species had spent millennia proving that superior firepower solved most problems. His scarred hide bore testament to countless victories, his movements radiated the controlled violence of a living weapons platform, and his general demeanor suggested someone who had never encountered an obstacle that couldn't be resolved through applied brutality. The collective faced him with the eerie synchronization of a distributed intelligence that had never known individual defeat, because it had never truly been individual. Their shared consciousness processed tactical scenarios faster than quantum computers. Their coordinated responses eliminated the communication delays that plagued lesser species, and their willingness to sacrifice individual components for strategic advantage made them functionally immortal in any practical sense. The match lasted 17 minutes, and required complete reconstruction of the arena's eastern wall. Corvash emerged victorious, but the victory carried a cost that registered in psychological monitoring equipment and medical scanners alike. For the first time in his military career, he had encountered an opponent that had forced him to fight defensively, to consider retreat as a tactical option, to experience something approaching genuine fear of defeat. The collective had pushed him beyond his comfort zone into territory where raw strength became insufficient and tactical thinking became mandatory for survival. More disturbing was the realization that the collective had been studying him throughout the match, analyzing his combat patterns, cataloging his psychological responses, documenting his tactical preferences, with the methodical precision of researchers conducting field studies. Even in defeat, the Unity of Purpose had gathered intelligence that would prove invaluable for future encounters. The human's semi-final opponent never materialized. Her scheduled adversary, a Vorthak strategic specialist, whose crystalline carapace could deflect starship-grade weaponry, had withdrawn from competition citing philosophical differences with tournament objective. The official withdrawal statement mentioned nothing about the 3 hours she had spent reviewing combat footage from the human's previous matches, or the probability calculations that had convinced her that participation would result in educational experiences she wasn't prepared to endure. Which meant the final match pitted Prince Corvash, apex predator, military genius, and living embodiment of Draknari's supremacy, against a remedial student whose species had been dismissed as diplomatically useful but militarily irrelevant. The betting pools had closed after generating mathematical paradoxes that threatened the stability of the Institute's financial system. The odds calculation algorithms had suffered complete failures when asked to process probability matrices for an outcome that violated 3 millennia of accumulated combat data. Corvash approached the final confrontation with the kind of focused intensity that his species reserved for truly worthy opponents, which represented the first tactical error he had made in 15 years of military service. He analyzed the human's previous victories, studied her unconventional techniques, and prepared countermeasures for every strategic innovation she had demonstrated, thereby making the classic mistake of assuming she had revealed her complete capabilities during preliminary match. The human entered the arena with the relaxed confidence of someone who had finished a particularly challenging research project
and was simply presenting her conclusions to the academic community. The match began according to established protocol, which lasted approximately 30 seconds before descending into something that military historians would struggle to categorize using existing terminology. The human's opening gambit involved a tactical approach that combined psychological warfare, environmental manipulation, and what could only be described as weaponized conversation therapy. She talked to Corvash while fighting, not the traditional combat banter that warriors use to intimidate opponents or boost morale, but clinical observations about his fighting style, detailed critiques of his strategic assumptions, and helpful suggestions for addressing the psychological issues that his combat patterns reveal. She fought like a therapist with a doctorate in applied violence, treating the match as an opportunity to help her opponent work through deep-seated emotional problems while simultaneously trying to kill him. More unnervingly, she was right about everything. The human demonstrated a comprehensive understanding of Draknari psychology that exceeded what should have been available to galactic anthropologists, much less a student from a previously unknown species. She identified personality patterns that Corvash had never recognized in himself, tactical preferences that reflected childhood trauma from his early military training, and strategic blind spots that had persisted throughout his entire career. She fought like someone who had spent considerable time studying not just Draknari combat doctrine, but the psychological foundations that made such doctrine effective. Every attack was calculated to exploit emotional vulnerabilities. Every defensive maneuver was designed to force psychological introspection, and every tactical innovation revealed another assumption that had never been properly examined. The match concluded with Corvash, flat on his back, technically undefeated but psychologically reconstructed, staring at the arena ceiling while contemplating fundamental questions about the nature of strength, the purpose of violence, and whether his entire worldview might require substantial revision. The human stood over him, offering a hand up with the kind of professional courtesy that battlefield medics showed to patients who had survived particularly educational trauma. The arena fell silent with the kind of profound quiet that accompanies the collapse of fundamental assumptions about how the universe operates. In the faculty viewing section, Professor Gorth was quietly updating his assessment of human capabilities from non-threatening to requires immediate administrative attention, while simultaneously wondering whether the Institute's insurance policies covered existential crises among apex predator species. The tournament's aftermath unfolded with the bureaucratic precision of an organization desperately trying to process information that challenged 3 millennia of accumulated knowledge. The human's victory was officially recorded as exceptional performance under unusual circumstances, which translated roughly to, "We have no idea how this happened, and we're not sure we want to understand." But understanding, as the Institute's faculty was beginning to realize, might not be optional. The human's post-tournament interview with the academic council revealed information that transformed a surprising student victory into a species-level intelligence crisis. She wasn't simply an exchange student seeking educational opportunities. She was a reconnaissance specialist, conducting comprehensive assessment of galactic military capabilities. Her remedial coursework had provided perfect cover for intelligence-gathering operations that had documented every major species' combat doctrines, psychological vulnerabilities, and strategic weaknesses. Earth, it seemed, approached interstellar relations with the same methodical precision that had allowed a physically unremarkable species to dominate their home planet, despite competing with creatures that were individually stronger, faster, and better armed. They studied their neighbors not as potential allies or enemies, but as research subjects whose capabilities required thorough documentation before formal diplomatic contact. The Grand Melee had never been about proving human capabilities. It had been a practical examination designed to test theoretical conclusions against empirical data. The tournament victories were research validation, not competitive achievement, as the human prepared for departure, loading research materials and detailed psychological profiles of galactic military leadership onto her transport shuttle. The Institute's faculty faced the uncomfortable realization that their prestigious academy had been converted into an involuntary research laboratory. They had spent an entire semester unknowingly providing education to someone who had been studying them with the clinical detachment of scientists, observing laboratory specimens. The final irony wasn't lost on Professor Gorth as he filed his administrative report. The Galactic Institute of Advanced Combat Studies, which had spent 3 millennia training the galaxy's military elite, had indeed provided education during the human exchange program. They simply hadn't been the ones doing the teaching. The academic records were quietly updated to reflect new assessment protocols for species whose capabilities couldn't be determined through conventional testing. Special procedures were implemented for future exchange students who might arrive with theoretical knowledge that exceeded their apparent practical limitation. Additional security measures were authorized for protecting sensitive information from beings whose academic curiosity might extend beyond standard educational objectives. But the most significant change was philosophical rather than procedural. The Institute's faculty began to consider the uncomfortable possibility that strength and intelligence might not be synonymous, that military superiority might not guarantee strategic advantage, and that the galaxy's most dangerous species might not be the ones with the biggest claws. Somewhere in the vast darkness, between stars, a small blue planet continued its quiet orbit, its inhabitants now possessing comprehensive intelligence files on every major military power in galactic civilization. They had learned what they needed to know about their neighbors, and they had done so while those neighbors dismissed them as diplomatically useful, but strategically irrelevant. The galaxy's established powers continued their ancient conflicts, secure in their mutual understanding of how warfare operated, blissfully unaware that they were now being observed by beings who had elevated asymmetric conflict to an art form. After all, humans had always been exceptionally good students. They simply preferred to choose their own curriculum